My father looked me dead in the eye and said, "We're not wasting our weekend sitting through another one of your army ceremonies." Then he grabbed the TV remote like he had just commented on the weather, instead of ripping something open inside his daughter. I remember standing there in my parents' kitchen in Akron, Ohio, still holding my phone in one hand while the smell of pot roast filled the room. My mother didn't even look up from drying dishes. My younger brother Ryan was laughing at something on television in the next room. Nobody reacted like anything important had happened. That was the part that hurt most. Not cruelty, indifference. 3 days later, I stood inside a crowded ceremony hall at Fort Meade wearing full dress blues, while 2 empty chairs sat in the middle row where my parents were supposed to be. Funny thing about military ceremonies, they all smell exactly the same. Burnt coffee, floor wax, cheap perfume, freshly pressed uniforms heavy with starch. You spend enough years in the army, and your body recognizes it before your brain does. Families packed the room that morning. Proud fathers adjusting ties, mothers crying before the ceremony even started. Little kids climbing onto folding chairs, waving tiny American flags like they understood the meaning of sacrifice better than most adults ever would. One grandmother near the front row kept dabbing tears from her face while her grandson straightened his lieutenant bars for the 5th time. Everybody belonged to somebody there. Everybody except me. Well, mostly except me. Hank Morrison showed up. 72 years old. Retired Army Ranger. Walked with a cane and complained about his knees every time humidity changed, which in Maryland meant constantly. He sat quietly near the back holding a Dunkin' coffee, and gave me a small nod when I walked into the room. That nod almost broke me harder than the empty seats did because at least one person thought this mattered. I kept glancing toward the doors anyway like an idiot. Some pathetic part of me still hoped my parents would walk in late looking apologetic and embarrassed. But they didn't. Of course they didn't. Colonel Hayes stood beside me near the stage before the ceremony started. "You good, Brooks?" he asked quietly. "Absolutely, sir." Standard Army answer. Didn't matter if your life was falling apart. You learned how to say absolutely. He studied me for a second longer than I liked before speaking again. "You earned this rank." Simple sentence. But I almost lost composure right there because nobody in my family had ever talked to me that way before. In our house, achievement always came with conditions attached. Ryan bought a used fishing boat with money he didn't have. Entrepreneurial spirit. I spent 11 months deployed in Afghanistan running intelligence operations while recovering from a knee injury. Well, at least you weren't infantry. Ryan opened a logistics company that failed within 18 months. Brave risk taker. I finished officer candidate school while working nights and sleeping 4 hours a day. You always were stubborn. Nothing ever counted fully. Not really. The ceremony started exactly at 10. National anthem. Opening remarks. Promotions one by one. Families clapped and cried while cameras flashed across the room. Some relatives had flown in from California and Texas just to watch their sons or daughters stand on stage for 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That's all people really get after years of sacrifice. 30 seconds and whoever bothered showing up. Then my name echoed across the room. Captain Elena Brooks, United States Army. I walked toward the stage automatically, muscle memory carrying me the rest of the way. And then I saw those 2 empty chairs again. Middle row, perfect view of the podium, empty. Suddenly I remembered the last school event my parents ever attended for me. High school graduation. Summer of 2005. My father complained the folding chairs hurt his back. My mother spent most of the ceremony talking about Ryan's baseball playoffs the following weekend. 19 years ago. Jesus Christ. Colonel Hayes pinned the gold oak leaves carefully onto my uniform. "Congratulations, Major Brooks," he said quietly. "You make this uniform proud." People applauded. Hank whistled loudly from the back row like some old combat sergeant embarrassing himself at a football game. I smiled because military officers learn how to smile when people are watching, even if something inside them is collapsing quietly. But standing there beneath those fluorescent lights with applause echoing around the room, I didn't feel proud exactly. I felt tired. You ever get hurt so many times by the same people that eventually the pain stops feeling sharp? That's what it felt like. Emotional scar tissue. After the ceremony ended, families crowded together outside beneath the flags taking photographs. Wives fixed collars. Parents hugged their children. Somebody popped champagne from a cooler in the parking lot even though I'm pretty sure that violated at least 6 military regulations. I stood there awkwardly holding the small cardboard box containing my old captain rank insignia, while everyone else celebrated with somebody who loved them openly. Hank eventually shuffled over beside me, tapping his cane against the pavement. "Your folks really skipped it?" he asked carefully. I nodded once. "Hell with 'em," he muttered. Then he handed me a folded McDonald's napkin, because apparently I'd started crying without noticing. That actually made me laugh a little. "Sorry," I whispered. "Don't apologize for being human," he grumbled. "Army's already done enough damage there." Very Hank answer. A young lieutenant walked past holding his little daughter on one shoulder. The kid saluted me seriously with frosting-covered fingers from a cupcake she was eating. I saluted back automatically. Then I walked alone to the parking garage and sat inside my Honda Pilot for almost 40 minutes without starting the engine. My knees ached from standing too long. Afghanistan. Airborne school. Years of carrying gear like my body would never eventually collect payment for it. I loosened my collar and stared at the gold oak leaves resting in my palm. Major Elena Brooks. 20-year-old me would have cried hearing those words. Back then, I enlisted mostly because I needed to escape Akron before I suffocated there emotionally. I still remembered sitting inside the recruiting office near Chapel Hill Mall, while rain hammered against the windows outside. The recruiter asked why I wanted to join. I almost answered honestly. Because nobody at home looks at me like I matter. Instead, I said, "I need a challenge." Same difference, maybe. I picked up my phone and opened my mother's contact information. My thumb hovered there for a long time. Then my hand started shaking slightly. Not dramatic shaking, just enough to irritate me. Sitting there alone in that parking garage, I realized something ugly. I kept waiting for people who had already decided who I was years ago. To my family, I would never be the successful child, never the important one, just the difficult daughter who joined the army instead of staying nearby and making life comfortable for everyone else. Ihiddelete. Her number disappeared from my screen. And sitting there beneath flickering garage lights while traffic echoed somewhere outside, I whispered something I didn't realize I'd needed to hear for years. I guess this promotion was only important to me. 6 weeks later, a photograph from a Pentagon cybersecurity briefing appeared in the Washington Post. I wasn't even the focus of the picture. A senior defense official stood at the podium discussing infrastructure attacks while I appeared off to the side, reviewing documents near 2 armed security personnel. That was it. One photograph. But back in Akron, Ohio, it might as well have been me landing on the moon. Old church friends started calling my parents. Neighbors suddenly remembered they knew me. People who ignored my existence for years started sharing the article online like they had personally contributed to my military career. Then one Tuesday night my phone rang from an unknown Akron number. I answered anyway. "Honey!" My mother's voice came through warm as syrup. "Why didn't you tell us you were doing something this important?" I should have hung up immediately. That's the honest truth. Not because I hated her. Hate would have been easier. Cleaner. What I felt was messier than that. Because even at 37 years old, part of me still wanted my mother to sound proud of me without there being some angle attached to it. Instead, she continued excitedly, "The ladies at St. Bernard's won't stop talking about that newspaper photo." There it was. Not "how are you?" Not "congratulations." Straight to audience reaction. I leaned against my kitchen counter in Alexandria, staring out at rain sliding across the apartment windows, while somebody walked a golden retriever through the parking lot below. "Mom," I said carefully, "it was just a briefing." "Well, apparently not just a briefing," she laughed softly. "Your father's been showing everybody that article." That almost made me choke. My father, the same man who called my promotion ceremony pathetic, now suddenly acting like I was some hometown hero because strangers approved first. I closed my eyes slowly. "You still there?" she asked. "Yeah." Her voice shifted into that fake casual tone I knew too well. "We'd really love for you to come home for a few days. Your father misses you." No, he didn't. But I let her keep talking anyway. Church friends. Neighbors. Ryan's kids asking about Aunt Elena from the newspaper. Every sentence circled back to public perception. Never once how proud they were of me as a person. There's a difference. People over 40 usually understand that difference painfully well. After we hung up, my stomach hurt. I poured stale coffee into a mug and stood there staring at the Pentagon photograph on my laptop screen. It really wasn't anything special. Me in uniform, papers in my hand, security personnel nearby. But back in Akron, perception was everything. Especially in old Catholic neighborhoods where everybody quietly measured each other's lives. Who got divorced? who lost money, whose children moved away and never came back. And suddenly I had become useful. 3 days later, my younger brother Ryan texted me for the first time in almost 8 months. "Proud of you, sis. Need to ask a small favor when you come home." I stared at the message long enough for my phone screen to dim. Then another text appeared. "Nothing major, just business advice." I laughed out loud at that. Not happy laughter either. The kind that escapes when you suddenly realize something ugly is unfolding right in front of you. And deep down, you already know exactly where it's headed. The first time my mother sounded proud of me in years, it was because strangers finally approved of my existence first. That realization sat in my chest like something heavy and wet for days after the Washington Post article came out. I wish I could say I ignored it. I wish I could say 18 years in military intelligence had made me emotionally bulletproof. But trauma connected to family doesn't work like that. It sneaks past logic. You can survive mortar attacks, 12-hour interrogations, deployment injuries, and classified pressure briefings, then suddenly lose your breath because your mother finally used a warm tone on the phone after spending most of your life emotionally withholding it. Human beings are complicated like that, especially daughters. Especially daughters raised in homes where love always felt conditional. By the second week after the Pentagon photographs spread around Akron, Ohio, my parents had apparently transformed me into a hometown celebrity. Former neighbors I hadn't spoken to since high school suddenly started sending Facebook friend requests. Women from St. Bernard's Parish commented beneath the article saying things like, "We always knew Elena would do big things," which honestly would have been more believable if any of them had remembered my existence before a newspaper gave them permission to. The strangest part was my father. According to my mother, he carried folded copies of the article around like a campaign flyer, showed people at the diner, showed guys at church. Apparently he even taped one beside the refrigerator at home. Same man who skipped my promotion ceremony because it was another one of those army things. I tried not to let it bother me. Really. I buried myself in work instead. Pentagon operations had a way of consuming your entire nervous system if you let them. Endless meetings. Security reviews. Infrastructure briefings. Intelligence updates arriving at all hours like the world personally refused to calm down for 5 consecutive minutes. Most days I left my townhouse in Alexandria before sunrise and returned long after dark with my shoulders locked tight from stress. But every night, eventually, my phone lit up with another message from somebody back home. Cousins, church friends, people who ignored my military career for almost 2 decades, suddenly acting fascinated by it. One evening after a 14-hour day, I came home, kicked off my boots near the door, and found 3 missed calls from my mother waiting on my screen. Before I could even decide whether to call back, my phone buzzed again. "Honey," she answered immediately after one ring like she'd been holding the phone in her hand waiting. "You never told us your work was so important." There it was again, important now. I leaned against the kitchen counter staring at rain streaking across the windows outside. "Mom," I said carefully, "my work has always mattered." Silence, just long enough to notice. Then she laughed lightly like I'd made a harmless joke instead of accidentally brushing against the truth. "Well, you know what I mean." "No. Actually, I didn't." She spent the next 10 minutes talking about reactions from people around town. How impressed everyone was. How Father Donnelly mentioned me after Sunday Mass. How neighbors suddenly wanted updates about my career. Not once did she ask how I was sleeping, or whether I was happy, or if 18 years in uniform had cost me pieces of myself I still hadn't fully recovered. That's the thing people misunderstand about emotional neglect. It's not always loud. Sometimes it sounds exactly like love, until you realize nobody is actually asking about you, only your usefulness. When we finally hung up, I stood alone in my kitchen staring at the silent phone in my hand while something old and familiar settled heavily inside my chest. That feeling of being seen only when I reflected well on somebody else. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "Ryan, proud of you, sis. Need a small favor when you come home." I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim. Then another text appeared. "Nothing crazy, just business advice." I laughed out loud standing there alone in my kitchen. Not happy laughter. The exhausted kind people make when life becomes predictable in the worst possible ways. Ryan never contacted me unless he needed something. Growing up, my younger brother had this unbelievable ability to fail upward, while everyone around him rushed to cushion consequences before they fully landed. Drunk driving charge at 23? Bad luck. Business collapse at 29? Tough economy. Divorce number 2? Crazy wife. Meanwhile, if I got a B instead of an A in high school, my father treated it like evidence of moral weakness. I tossed my phone onto the couch and tried to ignore the crawling feeling in my stomach. But 2 days later, things got much worse. Much worse. I was leaving a secure briefing room inside the Pentagon when my government phone buzzed from an internal number I didn't recognize. Major Brooks speaking. Major, this is Special Counsel Whitaker from Pentagon Legal Affairs. Do you have a moment? Just hearing those words can ruin somebody's entire week. I stepped into an empty hallway immediately. Yes, sir. There was a pause before he spoke again. Your name has surfaced during an ongoing procurement investigation involving Brooks Transport and Supply out of Ohio. My blood turned cold instantly. Ryan. Of course. I leaned against the wall hard enough my shoulder hit a framed Air Force photograph behind me. What kind of investigation? Fraudulent representation connected to defense subcontracting. Jesus Christ. The attorney continued in that flat professional tone lawyers use when they've delivered terrible news too many times to personalize it anymore. Your brother has reportedly referenced your Pentagon position in several recommendation documents. My stomach dropped. I never authorized recommendation documents. We understand that now. Now. That word stayed with me. He emailed files while we spoke. My hands actually shook opening the attachments. There it was. My forged signature. My rank. My title. Recommendation letters claiming Major Elena Brooks personally endorsed Ryan's company for logistical reliability and vendor access. They looked real enough to scare me. Sir, I said quietly, I had absolutely no involvement in this. We understand your position, Major. However, until the investigation concludes, you need to avoid direct communication regarding these contracts without legal awareness. The hallway suddenly felt too warm. What happens if investigators believe I knew? Long pause, then carefully. You could temporarily lose clearance pending further review. I closed my eyes. 18 years. Deployments. Sacrificed holidays. Torn cartilage. Failed marriage. Every piece of my career suddenly felt fragile because my brother decided consequences were optional. And my pension? Another pause. We're not there yet. Not there yet. Wonderful. After the call ended, I stood in that hallway staring at my forged signature for nearly a full minute, while people walked past carrying briefing folders and classified binders like the world hadn't just shifted sideways beneath my feet. The worst part wasn't even the fraud itself. It was the fact I wasn't surprised. Deep down, some exhausted part of me had always known Ryan would eventually drag somebody else into the consequences he spent his life outrunning. That evening I drove to Colonel Hayes's townhouse in Arlington because I genuinely didn't trust myself to be alone with my thoughts. His wife opened the door holding a casserole dish and immediately said, "You look terrible," which honestly felt comforting in a weird military family way. Hayes listened quietly while I explained everything over coffee at the kitchen table. When I finished, he leaned back slowly and rubbed his jaw. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked finally. "I'm not even shocked." "No," he said calmly. "You're disappointed. Different thing." I stared at him. He pointed toward the newspaper clipping folded beside my coffee mug. "In intelligence work, the most dangerous people usually aren't the ones who hated you from the beginning." He tapped the paper lightly. "They're the ones who suddenly start smiling after discovering your value." That sentence hit harder than almost anything else had, because it wasn't just true professionally. It was true about families too. A week later my mother called again asking when I planned to visit Ohio. This time her voice sounded strangely careful underneath the sweetness. Too measured. Like somebody following instructions. "Your father misses you," she said softly. No, he didn't, but I let her keep talking anyway. She mentioned church friends asking questions. Ryan's children wanting to see Aunt Elena from the newspaper. Every sentence circled back toward public image like the family suddenly needed me for something larger than pride. Then Ryan texted again. "Need your advice before a contract meeting." Contract meeting? My stomach twisted immediately. That night I sat at my kitchen table rereading the investigation documents, while rain hammered softly against the townhouse windows outside. Fake endorsements. Forged signatures. References to Pentagon relationships. Ryan hadn't just exaggerated connections. He impersonated federal credibility, using my career like a borrowed costume. Somewhere around midnight, realization finally settled over me fully. My family didn't suddenly value me because they finally saw me clearly. They valued access. Protection? Reputation? Influence. For the first time in my life, my success had become useful to them, and deep down, I already knew exactly how dangerous that was going to become. I realized my family had already chosen my brother over me long before the federal investigation ever started. The investigation just forced them to stop pretending otherwise. After Pentagon Legal contacted me, I stopped sleeping normally. Not completely. Just the kind of fractured sleep military people develop after too many years of living in permanent alert mode. 2 hours here, 40 minutes there. Wake up sweating because your brain remembered another possible consequence at 3 in the morning. Every time my phone vibrated, my stomach tightened automatically. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios. Clearance suspended. Internal review boards. 18 years of service collapsing because my younger brother thought my career was something he could borrow like a lawnmower. Washington looked colder after that. Not physically colder. Emotionally, the Pentagon hallways suddenly felt narrower somehow. Every security badge swipe sounded louder. Every legal email made my pulse jump. I found myself rereading ordinary messages 3 times before replying because fear does strange things to concentration. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the dark computer monitor inside a secure briefing room and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes looked tired, older, like stress had physically moved into my face while I wasn't paying attention. Colonel Hayes noticed too, of course. Senior officers always notice when one of their people starts carrying invisible weight. "Walk with me," he said quietly after a cybersecurity briefing ended late Thursday evening. We crossed one of the long underground Pentagon corridors while people rushed around us carrying binders and coffee cups like national security depended entirely on caffeine and PowerPoint presentations. Honestly, maybe it did. "You heard anything else from legal?" he asked. "Not yet." "And your brother?" I let out a slow breath. "He keeps texting." Hayes nodded once like that confirmed something for him. "Guilt?" "Mostly. Family's good at that." We stopped near a vending machine humming against the wall. Hayes studied me carefully before speaking again. "You know why this is hitting you so hard?" I crossed my arms. "Because my career might implode?" "No." His voice stayed calm. "Because some part of you still wants your family to finally choose you." That sentence landed like a punch because it was true. God, it was true. I looked away immediately. Hayes sighed softly. "Elena, some people only recognize value after strangers assign it first. Doesn't mean you deserved the years before that." I didn't answer because if I did, I probably would have embarrassed myself crying inside a Pentagon hallway. Instead, I changed the subject like emotionally damaged adults always do. Legal mentioned potential clearance review. "Which is why you need to protect yourself immediately." "Meaning?" Hayes looked directly at me. "You stop treating this like a family problem and start treating it like a federal investigation." That changed something inside me. Because until then, I had still been emotionally approaching this like a daughter and a sister. Hurt, betrayed, confused. But Hayes was right. Ryan didn't accidentally create paperwork mistakes. He forged Pentagon endorsements using my rank and security position. That wasn't family drama anymore. That was career destruction territory. That night, I drove home through Arlington while rain blurred the windshield and old Bruce Springsteen songs played quietly through the speakers. Somewhere near the Roosevelt Bridge, my mother called again. I almost ignored it. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice sounded painfully warm. "How's work?" There it was again. That careful tone people use when they want something before they've admitted it yet. "Busy. Your father's been talking about visiting Washington sometime." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny, because my father had spent most of my adult life treating my military career like an inconvenience. Now suddenly he wanted a Pentagon tour. "What?" my mother asked carefully. "Nothing." Silence stretched briefly between us. Then finally she said it. "Ryan's struggling a little right now." Of course he was. Every conversation eventually rotated back toward Ryan like gravity itself worked differently inside my family. He mentioned that. "He just needs support." "Mom," my voice sharpened slightly. "Did he tell you federal investigators contacted me?" Silence. Then softly. "He made a mistake." I actually closed my eyes sitting at a red light while rain slid across the windshield. "No, he committed fraud." "Elena." "He forged Pentagon documents using my name. He was desperate." There it was. The family religion I grew up inside. Ryan's bad choices always became circumstances instead of decisions. My mistakes became character flaws. His became tragedies requiring rescue. Do you know what happens if they think I helped him? I asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Honey, you know your brother loves you. That sentence nearly broke something in me. Not because it comforted me, because it avoided everything real. Good night, Mom. Wait. I hung up before guilt could stop me. Then I sat in traffic, gripping the steering wheel while tears blurred my vision hard enough. I had to pull into a gas station parking lot for 10 minutes just to breathe normally again. That's the ugly part nobody talks about when it comes to emotionally neglectful families. Even when they hurt you, you still mourn the version of them you spent your entire life hoping would finally appear someday. 2 days later, Ryan called directly instead of texting. I answered mostly because I was tired of anticipating it. Sis. His voice sounded exhausted. You need to help me. Not hello, not how are you. Straight to survival. Ryan, Pentagon, legal already contacted me. Silence. Then. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Okay, look, it sounds worse than it is. You forged federal endorsements. I borrowed credibility. I almost laughed. Borrowed credibility? Everybody exaggerates business relationships. Not using Department of Defense signatures. He exhaled heavily into the phone. I was trying to save the company. By risking my career, you make it sound intentional. That part finally made me angry. Real anger. Cold anger. It was intentional. Silence again. Then softer. Elena, if this collapses, I lose everything. There it was. The pivot toward emotional hostage. Taking. You should have thought about that before using my name. My kids could lose the house. God. That sentence hit exactly where he wanted it to. Because Ryan knew me. Knew guilt worked better than pressure. Knew family had trained me my entire life to protect everybody else before myself. I stared through my townhouse windows at rain dripping from bare tree branches outside. What exactly do you want from me? Just say you knew about the endorsements. My entire body went still. Absolutely not. Nobody gets hurt if we smooth this over now. Ryan, are you insane? His voice sharpened immediately. I'm your brother, and I'm a federal officer whose signature you forged. He went quiet after that, then finally muttered, You always thought you were better than us. That one hurt because it sounded exactly like our father. Same bitterness, same resentment toward ambition. No, I whispered. I just worked for everything you kept trying to shortcut. He hung up on me after that. I sat alone in my kitchen staring at the dark screen for a long time afterward while old pains slowly surfaced beneath the new betrayal. Suddenly memories started replaying themselves differently. Ryan wrecking Dad's truck at 17 while everybody comforted him because boys make mistakes. Me graduating near the top of officer candidate school while my father shrugged and asked if I planned to ever settle down normally. Ryan failing business after business while my parents kept writing checks. Me deploying overseas while they complained holidays were quieter without him around. The favoritism wasn't subtle. I had just spent years pretending if I worked hard enough, eventually, love would become equal too. A week later, another call came from Pentagon Legal. Additional forged documentation had surfaced. Fake vendor support letters. Procurement references. My title used repeatedly to imply insider Pentagon access. By the end of the conversation, my hands were shaking hard enough. I nearly dropped the phone. That night I drove to Arlington Cemetery and sat alone in my car overlooking rows of white headstones disappearing into darkness. I used to come there sometimes after difficult deployments, because perspective matters near places like that. Thousands of people buried after sacrificing pieces of themselves for something bigger. I sat there nearly an hour listening to rain tap softly against the roof while one horrible realization finally settled over me completely. My family wasn't asking me to help Ryan because they believed in me. They were asking because they believed I would sacrifice myself quietly the way I always had. That was my role. Responsible daughter. Reliable daughter. Useful daughter. The one expected to absorb damage so everyone else stayed comfortable. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized I didn't want that role anymore. The next morning, before sunrise, I sat at my kitchen table holding a cup of coffee gone cold hours earlier, while reading through every investigation file again. Outside, Washington was still dark except for headlights moving through rain. Finally, around 5:30 in the morning, I picked up my phone and dialed the number Special Counsel Whitaker gave me. A woman answered after the second ring. Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I took a slow breath. "This is Major Elena Brooks," I said quietly. "I'm ready to cooperate fully." And somehow, for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally felt less afraid than exhausted. Coming home should not feel like walking back into the place where you first learned how invisible you were. But that's exactly what it felt like when I drove into Columbus, Ohio, 3 days after agreeing to cooperate with federal investigators. Rain followed me the entire way from Washington. Thick, gray November rain that turned highways silver and made every gas station coffee taste even more hopeless than usual. By the time I reached the West Side neighborhood where I grew up, my shoulders already ached from tension. Funny how the body remembers places before the heart does. The streets looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller exactly, just worn down around the edges. The old grocery store near the parish parking lot had closed. The diner where my father used to take Ryan after baseball games now had plywood over the windows. Even the trees looked tired. My parents still lived in the same split-level house I grew up in. Same cracked driveway. Same crooked basketball hoop Ryan nearly broke his neck on when he was 13. Same Virgin Mary statue near the front porch with chipped paint around the hands. I parked the rental car and sat there for a full minute gripping the steering wheel while rain slid slowly down the windshield. Part of me wanted to drive straight back to the airport. Another part, the stupid wounded daughter part, still hoped maybe this visit would somehow feel different. Then the front door flew open. "Elena." My mother hurried outside, smiling too widely. Arms already open before I even stepped out of the car. She hugged me tightly beneath the drizzle while talking too fast. "Oh my God, look at you." There it was immediately. Performance energy. She stepped back, admiring the garment bag hanging in my hand with my dress uniform inside. "You look so important now." Now. Interesting word choice. Not "you look beautiful." Not "I missed you." Important. Useful. Valuable. The house smelled exactly like my childhood. Pot roast, lemon furniture polish, old carpet, and coffee brewed too strong. Everything looked frozen in time. Same family photos climbing the staircase wall. Same wooden cross hanging above the dining room entrance. Same beige recliner my father practically fused his body into every evening for 20 years. Except now there was something new sitting proudly on the coffee table. A framed copy of the Washington Post article with my Pentagon photograph. I just stared at it silently. My father walked out from the kitchen carrying a beer. "There she is," he announced loudly. "The Pentagon celebrity." Then he kissed the top of my head like we'd always shared some warm father-daughter relationship instead of years of emotional distance covered by occasional holiday phone calls. The fake affection almost made me physically uncomfortable. "Long flight?" my mother asked quickly. "You hungry?" "Sit down, honey." Question after question after question, but not one apology, not one mention of the promotion ceremony they skipped. I noticed that immediately. Ryan arrived an hour later wearing jeans, work boots, and the same easy grin he used whenever he needed people to underestimate consequences. "There's my favorite federal employee," he joked, hugging me. He smelled faintly like expensive cologne layered over cigarette smoke. "You only have one federal employee sibling." "Exactly why you're the favorite." Everybody laughed lightly. My father handed Ryan a beer while my mother rushed around the kitchen trying too hard to create normal family energy out of something deeply broken underneath. We sat around the kitchen island pretending this wasn't the first time we'd all been in the same room together in nearly 2 years. Ryan kept steering conversations toward business. Supply chain problems, shipping delays, contract opportunities. Every few minutes he casually referenced government work while glancing toward me. Like he wanted everyone constantly reminded that he had connections now. Connections named Elena. Finally, he leaned closer while my parents cleared dishes. "So, hypothetically," he said casually, "if somebody exaggerated professional relationships on paperwork." I looked at him flatly. "Hypothetically?" He sighed dramatically. "Come on, Elena." "No, you come on." Silence dropped between us instantly. Ryan rubbed his forehead. "I was trying to save the company." "You forged Pentagon endorsements." "I borrowed credibility." I laughed softly at that because hearing a 42-year-old man describe federal fraud like creative networking was honestly insane. My father walked back into the kitchen just in time to hear tension rising. "Now hold on," he interrupted immediately. "Nobody's saying Ryan handled everything perfectly." "Interesting." "Nobody said perfectly. Not illegal. Not dangerous. Just imperfect." "Really?" I asked quietly. "Because that would be refreshing." My father's expression hardened instantly. There it was. the old family rhythm snapping back into place like muscle memory. Ryan causes destruction. Elena becomes the problem for noticing it. My mother stepped in quickly with that exhausted peacemaker energy she'd worn her entire life. "We're all tired," she said softly. "Let's not fight tonight." Fight. Another interesting word, because apparently telling the truth counted as conflict in this house, while lying only counted as stress. That first evening dragged forever. At one point, neighbors from across the street conveniently stopped by after hearing I was in town. Conveniently, my ass. My father practically glowed, introducing me around. "This is my daughter Elena," he announced proudly. "She works with Pentagon operations." I almost flinched hearing pride in his voice now after spending most of my adult life trying unsuccessfully to earn it honestly. One older neighbor shook my hand respectfully. "Thank you for your service, Major." That part still always hit me strangely. Strangers respected my career more deeply than my own family ever had. Later that night, after everyone finally went upstairs, I stood alone in my childhood bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror beneath harsh yellow lighting. I looked tired. Not old exactly. Just worn down in places life had pressed too hard against over time. My knees ached from the flight. My shoulders stayed permanently tight these days. I turned on the faucet because suddenly I realized I was crying and didn't want anyone downstairs hearing it. That's the thing nobody tells you about emotionally neglectful families. Even when you finally understand the pattern clearly, part of you still grieves the childhood you almost had. I looked toward the old framed photograph sitting near the medicine cabinet. Me and my ex-husband Marcus at an army banquet nearly a decade earlier. I looked happier there. Or maybe just more hopeful. Marcus used to joke that the military got the best version of me while my family only wanted whatever energy remained afterward. Turns out even that was generous. The next morning things became impossible to ignore. My mother spent breakfast talking about church gossip while my father read the sports section pretending nothing important existed outside football scores. Ryan eventually wandered downstairs around 10 wearing sweatpants and carrying coffee. "Hey," he said quietly. "Can we talk outside?" We sat on the back patio while cold wind pushed dead leaves across the yard. For the first time since I arrived, Ryan actually looked nervous. "I need help," he admitted finally. There it was. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I messed up." Help. "Pentagon Legal already contacted me," I said calmly. His face lost color instantly. "They actually called you?" "Yes." Ryan stared toward the fence for a long moment. "I never meant for this to get so big." "You forged federal documents." "I was desperate." "You used my name." "Because people respect you." That sentence made something unexpectedly painful twist inside my chest. "Because nobody in this family respected me until outsiders started doing it first." Ryan leaned forward. "If this collapses, I lose everything." "You should have thought about that earlier. My kids could lose the house." There it was. Emotional hostage tactic. Family weaponizing children because accountability alone wasn't persuasive enough. I stood up before I said something cruel. That afternoon I overheard my parents talking downstairs while carrying laundry past the basement steps. My father's voice floated upward clearly. "Tell her to sign whatever Ryan needs." My mother sounded nervous. "What if she refuses?" My father snorted. "What else does she have? She's divorced, no kids, money sitting in the bank doing nothing anyway." I froze halfway down the hallway. Then he said the sentence that finally shattered something permanently inside me. "And if she won't help, family ought to make people understand she turned her back on us." Something inside me went completely still after that. Not heartbreak anymore. Clarity. Pure clarity. That night, lying awake in my old bedroom, listening to the furnace kick on and off through the walls, I finally understood something terrifying. They weren't asking me to save Ryan. They were asking me to sacrifice myself for Ryan the same way I always had. Only this time, the cost could destroy everything I built. And, for the first time in my entire life, I realized I was done paying it. Sunday dinner at Ryan's house started at 4 in the afternoon and somehow already smelled like beer by 3:30. That was pretty standard for my brother. His place sat on a quiet cul-de-sac outside Columbus, in one of those newer subdivisions built during the housing boom years before everything slowly started falling apart. Vinyl siding, oversized pickup trucks parked in driveways, plastic holiday decorations still sitting on porches weeks too long because nobody cared enough to take them down. I parked half a block away and sat inside the rental car for a minute, watching relatives drift into Ryan's house, carrying casseroles and folding chairs. while cold November wind pushed dead leaves across the street. Family gathering. That's what my mother called it. But everybody knew what it really was. A performance. Ryan wanted witnesses around him, human shields. If enough family packed the room, maybe nobody would ask difficult questions. I checked the time on the dashboard. 4:07 p.m. Then I stepped out of the car wearing full army dress blues. Funny thing about military uniforms, people react before you even speak. Some stand straighter automatically, some get nervous. Remember. And some suddenly start treating you like you matter because authority makes them uncomfortable. As I walked toward the house carrying a folder beneath one arm, conversations near the driveway visibly slowed. My cousin Linda blinked twice. "Jesus, Elena," she said quietly. "You look official." Apparently that's my personality now. A few people laughed awkwardly. Inside, Ryan's house looked exactly like every Midwestern family gathering in America. Football game blasting from the television, folding tables covered in baked ziti and potato salad, beer bottles sweating rings onto kitchen counters, somebody arguing politics too loudly in the dining room, children running through hallways while exhausted mothers pretended not to notice. My mother rushed toward me immediately. "Honey, everybody's so excited you came." She kissed my cheek and lowered her voice carefully. "Please keep things calm tonight." Interesting choice of words. Keep things calm. As if I was the dangerous one. My father stood near the fireplace holding a beer while talking to 3 older men from church. The second he saw me, his entire posture changed. "There she is," he announced proudly. "My Pentagon daughter." I almost physically flinched hearing that. Pentagon daughter. Not difficult daughter. Not stubborn daughter. Not the child whose military career was apparently too boring to attend a promotion ceremony for. Amazing how quickly language changes once public reputation gets involved. One of the older men shook my hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, Major." "Thank you, sir." My father grinned like he personally earned my rank himself. "She's doing high-level cyber operations now," he added proudly. "Classified stuff." I looked directly at him. "You don't even know what I do." The smile on his face flickered slightly. Just enough. Ryan appeared from the kitchen carrying a beer and smiling too broadly. "There's my sister," he announced loudly. "Probably the smartest person in the entire Department of Defense." That's definitely not true. Still humble too. He kept talking before I could respond. "You should hear the kind of projects she works on." I noticed something then. Ryan was sweating slightly despite the cold weather outside. Not enough for most people to catch. But military intelligence teaches you to watch people carefully. Underneath all the charm and noise and performance, my brother was terrified. Good. Dinner dragged on forever. Football screamed from the television while relatives passed around mashed potatoes pretending nothing serious existed beneath the surface of the evening. Ryan kept casually mentioning business deals between bites of food. Once this next contract closes, things finally stabilize. Or, government work takes patience, but connections matter. Connections. He kept looking toward me every time he said that word, silently trying to pressure me into playing along with the fantasy. At one point, my mother leaned close and whispered, "Maybe after dinner you and Ryan can figure things out privately." I looked directly at her. "You mean cover for him privately?" Her face tightened immediately. Across the table, my father suddenly raised his beer bottle. "I just want to say something." Conversations quieted automatically. "Families go through rough patches," he continued. "But seeing Elena in that newspaper article made me realize how blessed we are." Murmurs of agreement spread around the room, and suddenly something inside me stopped hurting. Not because things improved, because clarity finally replaced hope. I understood the entire game now. They didn't want truth. They wanted comfort restored. Reputation protected, Ryan rescued. Family image preserved. And they expected me to sacrifice myself quietly to make that happen like I always had before. I set my fork down carefully. "Actually," I said calmly, "there's something everybody here should probably know." The room went still almost immediately. Ryan's smile disappeared. My mother looked terrified. I stood slowly. "Years in uniform teach you how to control breathing under pressure. Useful skill. 3 weeks ago," I said evenly, "I contacted Defense Criminal Investigative Service regarding fraudulent documents connected to Ryan's company." Silence swallowed the room completely. You could hear the football announcer from the next room. Ryan laughed nervously first. "Okay, hold on. I opened the folder beneath my arm and placed printed documents carefully across the dining table. Forged recommendation letters. Fake Pentagon endorsements. My forged signature attached beside Army credentials Ryan had no legal right to use. Relatives leaned forward reading quietly while confusion spread across their faces. My mother looked like someone drained all the blood from her body. My father stared at the pages without speaking. Ryan stood up so quickly his chair slammed backward onto the floor. "You went behind my back? You forged federal documents. I was trying to survive. You used my military clearance. You're my sister." There it was again. Family. Funny how family suddenly became sacred whenever Ryan needed protection from consequences. I kept my voice calm because if I raised it, they would focus on my anger instead of his actions. "No," I said quietly. "You wanted access to my career without earning any of it. You think you're better than everybody now because you wear that uniform?" My father finally exploded. "Enough!" The room shook silent again. I turned toward him slowly. "No, Dad, you had enough opportunities." My mother started crying quietly beside the sink. Real tears, too. That almost made it harder. Almost. Then the front doorbell rang. Nobody moved. The bell rang again. Ryan looked physically sick now. "Oh my God," he whispered. I looked directly at him. "I asked them to come tonight." My mother gasped softly. One of my younger cousins muttered, "Jesus Christ." My father stared at me like he no longer recognized his own daughter. I walked calmly toward the front door, while every eye in the house followed me. 2 Defense Criminal Investigative Service agents stood outside beside an IRS investigator, wearing a dark overcoat against the cold. No dramatic raid jackets. No yelling. Just paperwork and consequences. The lead investigator nodded politely. "Major Brooks, thank you for cooperating." "Of course." Behind me, the entire house had gone completely silent. The agents stepped inside calmly. "Mr. Ryan Brooks?" Ryan didn't answer. My father suddenly shouted across the room, "You embarrass this family." The words echoed off the walls hard enough to sting. For a second, nobody breathed. Then I turned toward him slowly and said the truest thing I'd spoken all weekend. "No, Dad." My voice sounded tired more than angry. "I just finally told the truth." Nobody spoke after that. Not my mother, not Ryan, not even my father. The investigators quietly began explaining legal procedures while relatives stared at me like they were seeing me clearly for the first time in their lives. And standing there in my dress uniform beneath the warm kitchen lights of the house where I spent years begging quietly to feel valued, I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Because sometimes freedom doesn't come from being loved properly. Sometimes it comes from finally refusing to be used anymore. Before this chapter ends, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever realized the people calling you selfish were only angry because you finally stopped sacrificing yourself for them? 3 months after federal agents walked into my brother's dining room and shattered the illusion my family spent years protecting, I stood alone beside the Potomac River, watching snow fall quietly across Washington, D.C. The city looked softer in winter. Less aggressive somehow. The monuments glowed pale through the fog while traffic moved slowly across the bridge behind me, like the entire world had decided to exhale at once. Funny thing about surviving emotional warfare inside your own family, the silence afterward feels almost suspicious at first. You keep waiting for another explosion, another guilt trip, another phone call demanding pieces of yourself you no longer want to give away. But eventually, slowly, your nervous system realizes the danger has passed, and when that happens, exhaustion finally arrives. Real exhaustion. The kind your body postpones until survival is no longer the top priority. Ryan accepted a plea agreement in January. Mail fraud, procurement fraud, false federal representation. The official legal language sounded cold compared to the emotional wreckage underneath it all. His company collapsed within weeks. Employees lost jobs. Vendors disappeared. The big house in the subdivision went up for sale before spring. Last I heard, his wife moved with the kids to her sister's place outside Cincinnati, while Ryan waited for sentencing. I should probably admit something ugly here. Part of me expected to feel satisfaction watching his life implode. After everything he risked using my name, maybe I even wanted that satisfaction. But real life rarely gives clean emotional victories. Mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the children. Sad for the years wasted pretending our family functioned normally. Sad for the younger version of myself, who spent decades believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. My father never called after the investigation became public. Not once. At first that hurt more than I expected. Then eventually, it didn't. That was the strange part. The pain faded faster than the guilt. My mother left voicemails every few weeks. Most started with crying. Some started with church updates. Others circled endlessly around forgiveness without ever fully touching accountability. Families shouldn't turn on each other, she whispered in one message at 2 a.m. I listened to it while sitting in Pentagon parking traffic beneath freezing rain and almost laughed. Because exposing fraud isn't betrayal. Using your daughter's military career like a shield against consequences? That's betrayal. Hank understood that immediately, of course. He invited me over every Sunday after church, whether I accepted or not. That became our strange little routine through winter. Me sitting in a retired ranger's cluttered townhouse eating overcooked pancakes while he complained about politicians and knee pain with equal bitterness. One snowy afternoon in February, he looked over from his recliner while some old war documentary played quietly on television. "You still waiting for your father to apologize?" he asked bluntly. Hank never believed in gentle conversation. I stared into my coffee mug for a second before answering honestly. "Maybe a little," he grunted. "That's the problem with good daughters." "What is?" "You keep thinking love eventually becomes fair if you suffer long enough." I looked at him quietly after that because sometimes old soldiers accidentally tell the truth with terrifying precision. Outside his window, snow drifted slowly across the parking lot while someone struggled to scrape ice from a windshield nearby. "You know," Hank continued, "combat teaches you something most families never do." "What's that?" He pointed toward me with his coffee mug. "People don't get unlimited access to hurt you just because you share DNA." That sentence stayed with me for weeks afterward. Maybe because deep down I already knew it was true. Spring arrived slowly that year. Washington thawed one gray morning at a time until cherry blossoms finally started appearing near the tidal basin like proof life could begin again quietly without asking permission first. Around the same time, Pentagon Legal officially cleared me of wrongdoing. No disciplinary action, no clearance suspension, no internal misconduct findings. 18 years of military service survived by inches because I chose truth before loyalty to people who never protected me the same way back. Colonel Hayes handed me the final clearance documents personally. "Congratulations, Major." I let out a slow breath reading the paperwork. "Feels strange celebrating survival." "That's because you're grieving too." I looked up. He shrugged slightly. "You didn't just lose trust in your brother." He paused carefully. "You lost the fantasy that your family would eventually become who you needed them to be." God. That hurt because it was exactly right. A month later, I sold the townhouse in Alexandria and moved into a smaller brick place near Old Town with creaky floors and too many windows. For the first time in years, I decorated somewhere exactly the way I wanted. No compromises. No worrying whether somebody else approved. Bookshelves near the fireplace. Old military photographs packed away instead of displayed like trophies. Basil plants in the kitchen window. Silence that felt peaceful instead of lonely. One Saturday morning I walked through the farmer's market near King Street wearing jeans and an old army sweatshirt when someone tapped my shoulder gently. "Major Brooks?" I turned around automatically. A young woman stood there holding a toddler on one hip while another little girl clung to her coat sleeve. She looked nervous. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I recognized you from one of the Pentagon hearings last year." I smiled politely. "That's rarely where people hope to be recognized." She laughed softly. Then, unexpectedly, her eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" She swallowed hard before answering. "My father stole money using my name when I was younger. I spent years protecting him because everyone said family comes first." Her voice shook slightly. "Watching your testimony helped me finally report him." For a second, neither of us spoke. The little girl beside her stared at me curiously, while street musicians played somewhere farther down the sidewalk. Finally, I asked quietly, "How are you doing now?" The woman looked down at her daughters before answering. "Peaceful. Peaceful." Such a simple word. But people who grow up emotionally neglected understand how rare peace actually is. That night I sat alone on my back porch while warm spring rain tapped softly against the railing and thought about everything that happened over the past year. The promotion ceremony, the empty chairs, the forged signatures, the federal agents, the family dinner, the silence afterward. And somewhere between the heartbreak and survival, I realized something important. My family spent years teaching me love meant endurance.